Okay, can you see the presentation now?
Yes,
Yes.
looks good.
Okay, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody. First, I would like to thank the organizers enabling this space, and of course, Professor David Boyd for listening. I call my paper, so this is Permanence, the Inter-American Human Rights System as a Liminal Space for Climate Justice. So as I was delving into different critical accounts of international law, including TWAIL, New Approaches to International Law, and Law and Political Economy, I saw that Marty Koskiniemi's work was being profusely cited, and that several scholars were drawing from this understanding of the indeterminacy of international law and its oscillatory nature. This oscillation moves according to specific interests. Critical scholars use this oscillation to describe different traditions and methods. International human rights and environmental law, which are the main legal regimes that are relevant to understand my object of analysis, the Inter-American human rights system, were also being described in this oscillatory continuum. The often contradictory views of scholars in the literature convinced me that the oscillatory nature of international law was somewhat reflected in scholarly debates too. So this led me to use Koskiniemi's classification and apply them to assort perspectives of international law in that very spectrum, which ranges from apologists on the one hand and utopians on the other. The latter are those critical views that are skeptical about the discipline because it carries imperial, colonial, and neoliberal connotations which impede a global order based on equality and emancipation. Contrariwise, the apologists are those who hold that international law, particularly human rights and environmental law, are far from perfect, but still have contributed significantly in dismantling patterns, legal frameworks, and discourses that affected oppressive polities across times and latitudes. After having established a seemingly adequate concept that helped me situate in opposing notions of international law, I needed to ascertain whether the Inter-American human rights system, as my object of analysis, could be inserted in said spectrum, and if that could entail an opportunity to add other international human rights bodies for comparative purposes. The main idea of this would be to map the assessments from critical legal scholarship and juxtapose them with the reality of human rights courts and bodies to determine whether that critique accurately depicts our object of analysis or not. In that sense, I want to highlight that the Inter-American human rights system operates mainly in Latin America, a region in the global south that englobes a vast history of dispossession and ecological ruin due to colonialism and contemporary global political economy. At the same time, I claim that within this space of confluence, victims that use these institutions normally come from impoverished backgrounds and marginality. This includes indigenous peoples, Black communities, rural communities, women and children living in poverty, amongst others. Victims and their stories are adding new meanings to international law. This is possible because they use the space of the Inter-American human rights system as their locus of enunciation. That is, the geopolitical and body political location of the subject that speaks. Of course, the institutional constraints and the indeterminacy of international law is still very much present, but these are voices of the oppressed making their way up into international lawmaking and having an impact in their local realities. This interaction between oppressed realities and a regional court from the global south has rarely been mentioned in the critical legal scholarship of international law. The next step then is to cluster the views from the utopians and the apologists in a way that allows me to address their most salient points and then test them against my object of analysis. To do this, I identify three main areas of critique in the literature concerning international human rights and environmental law. The first one is a critique on colonialism. Critiques that utopians advance to analyze international human rights and environmental law include the inherent proclamations of abstract and universalizing principles that characterize modernist thinking and a keen awareness of the legacy of colonial, racist, and patriarchal heritage inserted in international law, both of which conceal the systems of power behind regimes of truth. Overall, TWAIL exposes the past and enduring inequality amongst nations in international law as the result of the colonial conquest, an assessment that also involves international human rights and environmental law. The second critique of international human rights and environmental law is its tendency to conceal the immanent contradictions of capitalism and its manifestation in the global political economy. In this vein, scholars have asked themselves if international human rights and environmental law might not be complicit with the creation and perpetuation of an unjust world. Scholars have claimed that human rights may have been useful to alleviate precarious situations in specific cases. They did remarkably little, nonetheless, to check the explosion of wealth and income inequality in an expanding neoliberal world order. This is the third critique. Some critical accounts of human rights shed light on the separation between contemporary humanist norms and the revolutionary utopian intention of state and nation building. The instillment of the language of human rights into the popular consciousness from 1980s onwards, so the argument goes, was the result of political utopianism that so long fired the modern quest for the nation state, but through the moral displacement of politics. International environmental lawyers, according to Natarajan, remain trapped in the seemingly inescapable orbit of globalized capitalism and myths of progress, unable to produce viable solutions to increase inequality and environmental destruction. On the other hand, the literature that posits a rather reflective defense of human rights hinges on the aspiration that current challenging times represent an opportunity for transformation, innovation, creativity, and experimentation. They also hinge on the historical legitimacy of human rights, both as a means and ends of struggles spearheaded by oppressed groups around the globe. They claim that empirically, the world is, in some respects, in a better condition due to the victories of the human rights movement. After this brief literature review, it is important to note that no account has challenged the oscillatory scholarly arguments of international human rights and environmental law based on the practice of regional human rights courts and bodies, or at least not from the vantage point of epistemic diversity that shapes the outcome of a human rights case. And with this, I'm segueing to the next section. This section of my presentation is an attempt at arguing a third strand of perspectives about international human rights and environmental law. In doing so, I want to focus on the practice of the Inter-American human rights system. This, I think, is a way to test the arguments from both utopians and apologists, whilst positioning the Inter-American human rights system as closest as possible to the utopian side of our international law continuum. In that connection, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has addressed most of the points raised by the critics in many of its judgments. The list of successful cases you see here is the result of victims that come from those sectors of the population in Latin America that are marginalized and under systemic vulnerability. Their agency, through the usage of their locus of denunciation, convinced the Inter-American Human Rights Court to broaden its interpretive approach toward Article 26 of the American Convention on Human Rights, which limits, in formal ways, justiciability of economic, social, and cultural rights. The court recognized notions such as pattern of systemic discrimination as part of its rationale, broadened the rights to cultural identity to include the special relationship between indigenous peoples with their territories, and declared the direct enforceability of the right to work. This is something critical legal scholarship has so far neglected, thus providing room for theoretical recalibration. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the court have linked environmental degradation to a reduction on the enjoyment of several human rights protected under regional human rights law. Although the San Salvador Protocol expressly recognizes a right to a healthy environment, violations of this right, in theory, should not give rise to its justiciability. However, this situation dramatically shifted after the Inter-American Court published its advisory opinion on human rights and environment in 2017 and its judgment on the La Cajonjad versus Argentina case in 2020, where the Inter-American Court deems the right to a healthy environment directly justiciable. Now, it is necessary to pose the question of this novel and ambitious development of rendering the right to a healthy environment directly justiciable, combined with the generous interpretative methods of the Inter-American Court, uses for the application of economic and social rights, can make a difference between when the climate crisis question reaches its docket. The climate crisis and how it will unfold in the real world is not something that critical legal scholars have seriously engaged with, but this paper argues it is a variable that should be taken seriously. Liminality is an anthropology notion which describes one transitional, ambiguous, and uncertain stage during rites of passage. However, its usage can be extensive to all forms of social interactions, including courts of justice operating in a continuum. Nevertheless, as in any other transformative endeavor, phases are constitutive of these rights, which bears the possibility of not reaching the transformative phase and thus remaining in a state of permanent liminality. I hereby argue that the climate crisis is a global challenge, entails both structural and doctrinal challenges for regional human rights organs. These fundamental constraints will severely impede the Inter-American human rights system to keep moving forward in the international law continuum towards the emancipatory realm where the utopians have placed their hopes, and it will irredeemably remain there permanently as a liminal space or as a possibility of transformation. I claim are at least two big impossibilities for reaching the emancipatory spectrum of the oscillatory spatial boundaries of international human rights law. The first one is the enclave nature of regional human rights institutions in the global south, such as the Inter-American human rights system, which is contingent upon hegemonic forces that drive global political economy, which in turn shape regional normative and political conditions. The other impossibility is the structural dependency of Latin America to its extractivist economic model, which mold the regulatory landscape that enables an investment-friendly environment, one in which human rights and ecological concerns become mere managerial secondary aspects. Therefore,
Last sentence, Juan.
With this I finish. This impossibilities confine the Inter-American human rights system into a liminal space, where the emancipatory potential is greater than in other human rights spaces, but still contingent upon extra legal conditions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot to digest, Juan. Thank you for that really fascinating presentation and full of insights. And I look forward to reading more of your work. I'm curious. You wrap up by talking about impossibilities, and I'm wondering when you describe things in terms of impossibilities, how do you find optimism for moving forward?
I mean, it's not easy. My optimism comes from the gap in the literature on how both traditional doctrinal scholars of human rights and critical scholars are not taking seriously the sides of production of law. In my case, I see how the epistemic diversity of a region as Latin America is a key contributing factor in the production of legal knowledge, and how this legal knowledge permeates the international legal order and contributes to new understandings of how we should interpret international legal standards, let's say. And so let's say that my optimism comes from these clashes, or this space where law is produced. I see it as a space, or as a crucible, where stories and geography and history and so on, it's basically the main sources of information beyond what we traditional lawyers would see as the traditional sources.
Mm-hmm.
I see that and I see there as the optimistic side, where there's creativity here, which is forged, let's say, by the subaltern wisdom.
Interesting. And you also spoke about, you framed this discussion in the context of climate justice. As of yet, there are no climate cases before the Inter-American Court. Is that correct? And so how do you think a case like that would actually get on the court's docket, and what do you think the court would do with it?
I mean, the two cases that have been more or less discussed before the Inter-American Commission are cases from the global north. So these are one case from the Inuit peoples in the U.S. and the Athabascan peoples in Canada. But the first one was dismissed. The second one still pending. And so far, there has not been any case so far from Latin America, where most of the legal production of the Inter-American human rights system comes from. And so what I argue is that, I mean, my study is a prognosis, right? It's to take into account what we have at present, to have a more or less a view of what might happen in the future. So I see that now, at least the Inter-American Commission is moving towards a more friendly understanding, or not friendly, but let's say like they're taking more seriously the topic of climate change into its remit. So that can be exemplified in some reports that the Commission has published, and they include climate change. And I also see that some NGOs, transnational partnerships of NGOs, are bringing these topics of climate change into discussion with Inter-American Commission, which in the future might actually provide some leverage, argumentation leverage for the court eventually.
And the other question I would love to get your thoughts on is, it seems to me that Latin American courts, including the Inter-American Court, are really at the forefront in terms of progressive jurisprudence about the right to a healthy environment. And yet Latin America, as you mentioned, continues to be a source of tremendous environmental destruction. And so how are we going to overcome that paradox between the progressive jurisprudence and the what we see on the ground?
I mean, I think that this is where my more realist or rather pessimistic stance comes from, because I know that law itself has a lot of limits. I mean, we cannot rely only on law for this to see these transformative changes. Well, it's just a tool, and many you know, grassroots organizations, frontline communities, they are very much aware of this. You know, like I understand that Latin America can have a lot of impact in the diplomatic legal order if they work in, you know, in tandem with one with the other country, to provide some, you know, more, let's say, macro dynamic change that unfortunately law might not provide. So that's the case, you know, for example, we have this amazing case in Colombia, you know, the Future Generations versus Colombia
Yes.
on climate change. And, you know, after 3 years of the, you know, path-breaking ruling in this case, they have not been able to implement the ruling, and the Amazon rainforest is still being wiped out, still being deforested. So, and this is because there are a lot of incentives to keep the natural resources extraction in the whole region, and that doesn't seem to stop anytime soon. So, I mean, yeah, law can provide a lot of leverage, and social movements also, but I think there's, you know, this huge, you know, narrative out there, you know, which come from political economy that, you know, should place our vision into perspective.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Juan.
Thank you. That was, I think that was also, do you mind if I add a quick comment? Something that struck me about your paper, if I understood it right, is that it felt like something you're thinking about in a way is sort of the conceptual engineering of rights and legal language. So on the one hand, you're locating that in the place of indigenous communities who are sort of reclaiming and reconstituting and rethinking these ideas in ways that sort of critical academia is not thinking about. They are sort of conceptually engineering these ideas. And to an extent that's happening in courts as well, as David points to, you know, the courts, the spaces where this, in Latin America, where this incredible jurisprudence is happening. But of course, conceptual, one can engineer a term only to, you know, there's limits to the kind of usefulness of that engineering, but also they get engineered from the other direction. They also get engineered by the state. So every new idea that emerges, notions of sort of climate justice and sustainability, they also kind of take on a life in the hands of the developers in the state. And so the kind of where we end up with these concepts seems like a really sort of important and compelling question. Thank you very much.
I would just, if I could just add to that reflection, Dina, that one of the things that I've learned from my interactions with indigenous scholars is that we, as kind of using this broadly, but as Western scholars, put far too much emphasis on the rights side of the equation and far too little on responsibilities. So that's something we could talk about in depth, I'm sure, in a future conversation.
And I hope this will be the beginning of lots of future conversations. But we're going to move forward. Dalit, over to you, and your 10 minutes starts now.
Thank you so much, Dina. Can you please just confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes.
Yep. Fantastic. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this amazing opportunity. My name is Dalit, and I'm an LLM candidate at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. I'm sitting here now in Johannesburg. I'm also a practicing associate in this area of the law. So I do mining and environmental law at a corporate law firm. And so my paper is based on both practical experience, but also the academic questions that I'm interested in. So my paper is titled Towards a Just Energy Transition in South Africa, Legal Perspectives. And my supervisor is Professor Tumai Murumbo. So my primary research question is, informed by legal perspectives, what are the key ingredients of a just energy transition in South Africa? And so this is going to be informed by context and various approaches in justice scholarship. So in terms of the context, there are lots of discussions happening globally about a just energy transition, and these are dominated by economic and political scholarship. The dominance of fossil fuels globally has led to injustices. In South Africa, there's a special flavor to this phenomenon of the dominance of fossil fuels, which is called the minerals energy complex, which refers to a system of capital accumulation that is centered on mineral extraction and processing. This has been embedded in South Africa. But it is commonly known in South Africa that the MEC is in crisis. We have load shedding, we have lots of problems with our monopolistic Eskom, who provides all of our electricity. So it's common cause that this MEC is in crisis. And so a just transition in South Africa must dismantle the MEC. But presently today, diversification attempts potentially undermine the just energy transition, some scholars have argued. So specifically, renewable energy independent power producer program, although it has implemented renewable energy into a predominantly coal energy system, it has, in a way, perpetuated the dominance of certain energy giants in the country without actually leading to a more socially owned energy system. And there are a variety of regulatory hurdles, which I'm not going to be able to get into as well, which also undermine this just energy transition. So the point is, globally and nationally, conversations are taking place that challenge the injustices associated with the status quo, which is a fossil fuel dependent based energy system. So in terms of the legal perspectives on the just energy transition, so the term just transition is rooted in the American trade unions, but this today has been extended and is now associated with the global move away from fossil fuel based energy systems. The point is that justice is a key element of the just transition, and so its meaning is contested. In South Africa, there is a constitutional imperative for justice and the achievement of sustainable development, that the energy transition must be a just one, but the Constitution does not prescribe the form of justice appropriate. So in terms of the dominant legal perspectives on justice in this space, so in terms of environmental justice, it focuses on the propagation of harms or unfair relationships between humans as carried out through the medium of the natural environment. Environmental justice scholars argue that there must be equal sharing in both the environmental burdens and the environmental benefits. And environmental scholarship is focused on the enforcement of environmental law, public participation in environmental decision-making, and exposure to toxic substances. So in South African context, environmental injustices are interwoven with abuses of colonialism, apartheid, and capitalism. And unfortunately, mining has played a key role in these things. And so environmental rights were viewed by many post-apartheid civil society organizations as a means to secure environmental justice, and it was included in the Constitution. And in the context of the just energy transition and environmental justice, this is very much tied to the original meaning of the just transition concept, whereby there was a focus on the successes and failures of the green and brown frameworks for mobilizing opposition to energy infrastructure. But recent campaigns focus on the green-only approach, which unfortunately undermines the historic roots between labor movements and civil society organizations with respect to these goals of a just energy transition. The trade-off mentality has also infiltrated the South African legal system, although there are ingredients for a key synergetic relationship between environmental justice and human rights. In practice, the environmental right is often pitted against other socioeconomic rights. And the Ecocide case is an example, which is quite recent, where the municipality actually defied environmental laws in creating a water project to bring water to a community that didn't have access to water. And that was actually set aside, that decision to that entire project. So the stifling of environmental justice in South Africa is exacerbated by the gap between what the law guarantees and then the lived realities. So then another dominant legal perspective globally and to a certain extent in South Africa is the climate justice narrative, which focuses on sharing the benefits and burdens of climate change from a human rights perspective. The climate justice scholars argue that there are many injustices associated with climate change, including the fact that the most of the worst impacts of climate change will be experienced by the poor and the vulnerable who have actually contributed least to the problem. And many of those, unfortunately, many of those vulnerable persons are located in the developing world. And so as part of climate justice, the principles of intergenerational equity and the need for common but differentiated responsibility in international negotiations is highlighted. So interestingly, climate and energy justice are featured a little bit less prominently in legal scholarship in South Africa, but this doesn't mean that they're not within the legal framework itself. So intergenerational equity as an element of the environmental rights incorporates climate justice to a large extent, which was confirmed by a court in Tabametsi, that there's this implied climate justice aspect. And then the climate change bill also notes the connection between climate change and the rights to dignity and life, and the risk that climate change poses in realizing those rights. So in terms of the just energy transition, the focus for climate justice scholars is on this fair or equitable transition to a low carbon world, and the challenges specifically faced by developing countries and vis-a-vis developed countries. And so the Paris Agreement, a critique of that is that the Paris Agreement as well is often future focused. And in the South African context, South Africa's nationally determined contributions in terms of the Paris Agreement are viewed as not as ambitious enough, but arguably justified by its developing country status. So the issue with the climate justice approach in the South African context is that intra-country inequalities are potentially lacking, which is a problem for South Africa because any just energy transition in South Africa must address inequality. And then in terms of energy justice, so the energy justice scholars argue that human rights must be applied throughout the energy life cycle. And the key themes are distributional justice, procedural justice, and recognition justice. There are references to energy justice principles within the South African legal framework, but there isn't a direct right to energy or electricity. And so it's often, it's quite interesting that the discussion doesn't always focus on energy justice, but there are ways that the right to electricity have been viewed by the courts. And so I kind of want to see if I can jump ahead, but the point is that the energy justice scholars in terms of the just transition will look at the link between climate change and disputes over natural resources between countries regarding the boundaries and ownership of various resources. So as I said, there are various examples of energy justice principles in South African legislation. Greenhouse gas emitters also rely on many aspects of energy justice, which includes energy security and access to defend their actions. And so there's a lot of polarization in South Africa. So in short, my paper focuses on this just transition approach that has been advocated for by Heffron and Macaulay. And they try and unite the three areas of scholarship that I've just mentioned, and they find these underpinning unifying principles, which they argue is distributive justice, procedural justice, and restorative justice. And without going too much into these different things, the distributive justice will focus on capabilities and well-being, risk and responsibility, vulnerability and recognition. Procedural justice is about the platform for justice demands, although often inadequate itself to produce a resolution, but it's a means to an end. And also it can initiate a long-term engagement with affected communities. And then restorative justice, which I think is quite key in the South African context, is about repairing harm that has been perpetrated towards an individual after an injustice has occurred, rather than focusing on punishing the perpetrator. So in terms of the critique of this just transition framework, I think that Nalulela provides a really interesting one, where she talks about energy progression as opposed to an energy transition. And essentially it turns on timing. Okay, thank you. It turns on the timing of the transition. So that's a good critique. And so actually, I unfortunately haven't been able to get to my kind of key ingredients, but using the Heffron and Macaulay's approach, I have put together a kind of a list of what I would think the key distributional justice elements, procedural justice elements, and restorative justice elements are with respect to the various South African contexts. And so it's all about electrification, reaching the most vulnerable, energy projects benefiting host communities and recognizing mistakes of the past in the mining sector with respect to certain BE policies. And then, yeah, so there's a number of things, but unfortunately, you won't be able to get into all of them. But yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Thanks, Dalit.
Yes, thanks very much, Dalit. So it's super interesting presentation, and obviously an extremely challenging situation in terms of the current energy mix in South Africa and the destination of a sustainable energy system. So I'm curious, one thing that really is at the heart of your presentation, I think, is how do we reconcile these competing rights, right? I mean, you mentioned that the right to electricity is not a recognized right, but how do we reconcile these competing economic and environmental rights in a developing country context?
Well, that is the challenge of sustainable development, is it not? And I think that it's a profound challenge. As I suggest in my paper, I think it requires a fundamentally, in the South African context, which is so fossil fuel dominated and fossil fuels are often tied to socioeconomic development, it really requires a reimagining of the entire system, breaking it down and trying to create an economy that centers around sustainable jobs and sustainable, more sustainable types of energy. And I think that, yeah, it is a challenge because, yeah, I think that there's a lot of polarization in South Africa. I see it in my job, between the different sectors of society. I mean, I represent a lot of corporate clients in mining and community disputes, and it's such a challenge. But I think that the point is that there are ways of building the narrative around a sustainable. If the core infrastructure is done, is rooted in renewable energy, then we potentially build an economy that is sustainable. But I don't think all the answers lie in renewable energy. I think there's some other, there's questions of timing and challenges around that. I think the other thing is, even with renewable energy, I mean, they take up a lot of space and land, and obviously we know in South Africa that the issue of land is a critical one. And so even there needs to be discussions and engagements with host communities in renewable energy context. And I know that the way that renewable energy has been introduced into the South African system today has been in a way that hasn't necessarily integrated local communities into the best way possible. Actually, it's the development institutions and the banks that are managing the local community engagement, as opposed to the actual independent power producer who's managing it for government. So there's a lot of challenges. I think there's a lot to be said about renewable energy and gearing the economy in that direction. There's a lot of funding available now for renewable energy that has not necessarily been available before. I really feel like we're in this key window in South Africa, and the political world just needs to turn into aligning the agenda. And actually there's opportunities, as I say, there's opportunities in funding now that haven't been available before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things I try and emphasize in my work on climate change, is that we should be taking a rights-based approach to all aspects of climate action, which goes to the issue of renewable energy, goes to the issue of just transitions. If we take a rights-based approach to all climate actions, then we are engaged by definition, we're engaging the affected communities and the rights holders in those communities, which should in theory address the problems. I think one of the challenges in South Africa is that this transition has been delayed so long, right? I mean, so there's been decades of opportunities lost, if you will, by inaction in South Africa. And that's comes back to what Juan was talking about, the political economy of energy in a country like South Africa, where you have a dominant company like Eskom and a history of economic reliance on the coal industry. They create a path dependency that's very difficult to diverge from. So yeah, I think linked to that, I mean, that's what I said right in the beginning, that a lot of the discussions today on the just energy transition in South Africa have been in the context of the political discussions and the economic discussions, and less so from legal scholars. And I think that there's definitely something to contribute from the legal scholars, because we are supposed to understand what justice is. I don't believe that all legal scholars do, and I'm
clearly learning about that still. There's a long way to go. But I'm just saying, I think that there needs to be a more prominent role of legal discussions in this, because at the moment there's a lot of policy documents, fragmented ones that are coming up. So we have a renewable energy roadmap, we have a green transport strategy. There's all these different kind of strategies, and it just needs this kind of consolidated approach. And you pointed to the lack of political will. I mean, I'm a law student, so I can't really speak to that, but I really believe that the ingredients from a regulatory perspective are mostly there. There are some that maybe need to be changed, but we have the right, in my view, the right legislation to, actually introduce renewable energy and to implement this just energy transition. The Constitution supports it. That's what I've also tried to show in my paper, but there's a lack of political will. And for as long as that lasts, yeah.
I'm gonna intervene. I really want everyone to have a chance. Thank you, David. Thank you, Dalit. That was a really fascinating conversation. We're going to move on to Hector and Juliana. And your time starts now.
Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you to the commentators, first of all. Well, Colombia has suffered the longest running armed conflict in the Western Hemisphere, with a multiplicity of actors, socioeconomic tensions, and a struggle for resources control. And so, unfortunately, illegal armed groups have caused serious impacts to the environment. It's in this framework that we wrote this book chapter, this argument. We construct this argument with my colleague Juliana Galindo of nature as victim in the Colombian armed conflict, the case of the attacks against oil infrastructure, and we need to talk about the transitional justice framework. So the transitional justice framework in Colombia may be divided in three main tenets. So the first one is the peace and justice process for the accountability of members of the paramilitary groups. The second one is the establishment of an administrative program of integral reparations and land restitution. And the third one, the important one for this book chapter, for our argument, is the peace agreement between the government and the FARC guerrilla that includes a justice component with the special jurisdiction for peace. So our book chapter argues that within the framework of the special jurisdiction for peace, particularly in the macro case 002, focus in the southwest of Colombia, all the elements are given to recognize nature as victim itself of the armed conflict, particularly the Mira River Basin and the Tumaco Bay in the Pacific Ocean. This from the analysis of the guerrilla attacks against the oil infrastructure in that region. But before, very briefly, I summarize the current situation of recognition of rights of nature in Colombia. And the most famous foundational case is the Atrato River case, which has some argue an ecocentric focus. And then we had the Amazon case that also recognizes the rights of future generations, while the peace by high altitude wetland. And interestingly, in 2019, 9 rivers were recognized as subject of rights. I highlight the Magdalena River, which is the most important river in Colombia. In 2020, the National Park of Los Nevados, which is a system of high altitude wetlands. And finally, the latest is the National Park of Salamanca Island, a mangrove system in the Caribbean coast. So let's focus in the transitional justice system and the special jurisdiction for peace. In 2019, the court recognized the Awa indigenous territory as victim of the armed conflict, and also recognized it as a subject of rights, and also recognized the legal representation with the indigenous community Awa. So this is for the case of the special jurisdiction for peace, but also for the peace and justice system, which is for the paramilitary transitional justice system. This year, the Magdalena River was recognized as victim of the armed conflict, but more like with an anthropocentric focus, focusing the cultural impact on the communities. So it is important to mention that we base our argument on the recent Colombian jurisprudence that recognizes nature as a subject of rights. The recognition of nature as victim of the armed conflict not only depends on the recognition of as a subject of rights, but also on the identification of the damages generated. As I previously said, the case law presented fits some important developments with the recognition of nature as subject of rights and even the recognition of the territory and a river as victims of the armed conflict. However, in our view, those rulings are in support of a more anthropocentric perspective, focusing on the damages suffered by the nearby communities and ethnic communities. Even though this is a relevant approach, especially in the armed conflict framework, we claim that it is also important to assess the direct impacts suffered by nature. So, Juliana.
Thank you, Hector. This proposal tries to cope with the legal gap when evaluating the direct damage caused to the biophysical elements of nature in the armed conflict, and also to promote a better understanding of the Colombian case where the environment was and is, until today, unfortunately, used to finance and sustain the military actions. Thus, we propose an ecocentric approach that will be used not only to an adequate assessment of the environmental impacts, but also could be key to clarify the motivations and those most responsible behind the criminal actions perpetrated by armed groups. This is crucial considering that the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, it's a transitional justice tribunal tasked with prosecuting the most serious crimes committed in the armed conflict by former FARC combatants, members of the public security forces, and in some cases, their parties. This prosecution effort must concentrate on those who have an essential role in their commission and following the microcriminal structures behind such as serious violations. So our research has led us to develop a legal strategy for the accountability of environmental crimes and damages based on an ecocentric approach in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace framework. First, we propose the recognition of nature as a victim of the armed conflict, not only depending on the recognition as a subject of rights, but also on the identification of the damages generated. As we previously said, there are some groundbreaking case laws precedents, but in our view, those rulings are supporting a more anthropocentric perspective, focusing on the damages suffered by the nearby communities or the ethnic communities. Even though this is a relevant approach and complementary, especially in the armed conflict framework, we claim that it's also relevant to assess the direct, non-human dependent impacts suffered by nature. For example, in the case of the attacks against the Trasandino pipeline, that is the case that we are studying, we identify how the explosions and fires intentionally occasioned by the FARC members generate severe damage to water sources, the soil, flora, wildlife, atmosphere, and even to the Pacific Ocean. These specific and direct impacts suffered by the ecosystem and biophysical elements of nature justified its recognition as a victim by itself of the armed conflict. The recognition of nature as a victim of the armed conflict could be insufficient without considering the motivations and responsibilities behind such victimizations. That is why we also propose that an ecocentric approach should be applied for the identification of the contextual elements and the patterns of microcriminality and in the armed conflict. Despite the Colombian conflict is motivated for multiple and complex reasons, one factor behind the economic and military motivations of illegal armed actors is the use of natural resources as a financial and sustaining source of military activities. In the case of the oil infrastructure attacks, these respond to a military strategy of the FARC guerrilla of economy of force, reducing military resources but causing biggest impacts to the state and private actors, a pattern that was very evident between the 2000 and 2010 decades. The specific attacks in the southern part of Colombia also respond to the rear position nearby national borders and the exploitation of oil for cocaine production. Here, an ecocentric approach will be useful for a better understanding of the relations between nature and conflict. But also, we consider it important an ecocentric approach to evaluate the criminal individual liability of the most responsible in the Colombian armed conflict. Returning to the oil pipeline attacks in the southern Colombia, we can see that those actions correspond to a deliberate action in the military strategy framework, pointing out a change of command and a policy of criminality. But more importantly, there are specific examples which indicate a level of awareness about the environmental impacts generated by the type of attacks. Despite this awareness of the impacts on nature, they still committed all these crimes. Now, the criminalization of these offenses against nature has a significant obstacle, that the national international law framework is an anthropocentric perspective. However, a way that we can refer to this problem or try to figure it out what to do, it's to refer to the rules of international humanitarian law that recognize the protection of nature during the conflict for prosecuting the most responsible actors of these crimes in Colombia. It's not enough, but it's the way that we have. So this proposal that considers an ecocentric approach, I'm just finishing right now. So this proposal that considers an ecocentric approach for assessing environmental damages, identify patterns of violence, and for a liability analysis seeks to promote a territorial and environmental perspective, not only the special jurisdiction for peace, but in the transitional justice frameworks. We believe that without an ecocentric understanding of the impacts of the armed conflict, peace and reconciliation process in Colombia will be incomplete. Thank you.
Pues muchas gracias, Hector y Juliana, for your super interesting presentation. And obviously, Colombia is at the forefront globally in terms of the rights of nature jurisprudence. And I'm curious what you think about the relationship between the Colombian state of the law and the efforts to have ecocide added as a crime for the International Criminal Court.
Well, I think that that's a big debate, especially in Colombia, about the International Criminal Court, especially because in any framework, the national or international, the crimes against the environment are important. there is no any big case that give us some light. And for be completely honest, I think that there is no debate in Colombia. We are more focusing, and I think that this is understandable, in the liability of massacres, of the forced disappearance, forced displacement, but it's little talk about the crimes against the environment and how that it's connected to the possible responsibility against the International Criminal Court. Now, as we say, we have a big problem also with this, and it's that in the Rome Statute or even in other criminal courts, international or national, there is no a crime that protects nature, no? So it's very difficult to create that nexus between the damage against the nature and the liability of an individual. And I think that that's our biggest problem, and that's why the debate's so out of scope in the academic and in the judicial debate.
Right. And so I'm curious too, if I was going to play the devil's advocate, I would say to you that if you accept this idea that you're proposing of nature as a victim in terms of the impacts of the civil war in Colombia, then wouldn't that same logic apply to the environmental destruction caused by the oil and gas industry in Colombia or the mining industry in Colombia? I mean, if you think of like El Cerrejón, one of the largest open pit coal mines on earth, right? Would you also not be opening the door to criminal liability of the corporations involved in those ostensibly legitimate business activities?
Hector, you want to say something?
Well, I I would say that, like, for the specific case we are arguing, which is the attacks against the oil infrastructure, we see like the deliberate action of the guerrilla against nature, or even holding nature like hostage as part of the belligerent actions. Whereas for the case of the open pit mining, coal mining, as you mentioned, there are other like interests at play. Whereas like here in the pipeline, there is like a direct nexus. So that's why I think it's interesting to open the door, this case, and then we can see, because in the long run, I think also like open pit, like the bit mining industries, the illegal mining, illegal gold mining, all of them are entangled on the armed conflict interests as well. But like this case allows to open that door because of this evident direct nexus between the belligerent action and the interest of damaging nature as part of the armed conflict.
Yeah.
And what? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Juliana.
No, sorry. No, I think that we are just taking the window of opportunity that the peace agreement opened with this possibility of the liability of the FARC members, and there is a specific clause in the peace agreement that talk about the environment. They don't talk about crimes against the environment, but talk about the importance of the environment in this specific framework that is the special jurisdiction for peace. So I think that we are taking the chance just because there is an opportunity. But what Hector says is true, and this is not so obvious when you are talking about third parties or private actors as the companies or international companies that. And also it's very difficult to make the nexus between the damage and the responsibility of the companies now. So that's why.
Yeah, and so in terms of remedies, like the process you're discussing, it sounds like the only remedies would be punishment of the FARC guerrillas who are involved in this. But I wonder if, where does that leave restoration and rehabilitation of the damage that's been done?
Mm-hmm. So
sorry, Juliana, I'm gonna push us forward. I'm sorry.
Oh, we have to.
We can talk later.
Okay, we're gonna move straight on to Rory then. Rory.
Cool. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks very much. Firstly, thank you for this opportunity. It's unbelievable. And then, so I just thought I'd introduce myself. My name is Rory Rubin. I am a LLM candidate at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And my dissertation paper somewhat talks about renewable energy in South Africa, and I wanted to sort of integrate that into my discussion. I don't have slides. I'm just going to speak and I'm going to look down at my notes every now and then. So the way I wanted to start this discussion was sort of talking about the human cost and bringing in the human cost into this question of coal mining, power generation, and what it does to people. I thought, these debates are always centered around, especially with academics, always centered around what's on paper, economics, development, and very often we don't really look at, okay, well, this is the person that's suffering. And so I went online and I looked at some interviews and I came across a couple named Catherine and Amos Mklangu, who live near a power station in Mpumalanga called Duve. And since moving there in the late 1990s, they both developed asthma. Amos, they both over 60, and Amos can't work anymore. He can't lift heavy things and relies on social grants by the government just to survive and support his family, whilst Catherine, with asthma as well, suffers regular periods of being bedbound with violent coughing. She's also weak and fatigued. And so I sort of wanted to go to the question of, sorry, I'm just plugging in my laptop here. I wanted to go to the question of, well, where's the protection for these people? And I looked at the Constitution, and there's a constitutional rights section 24B, which essentially says that every person in South Africa, regardless of being a citizen or not, has a right to live in an environment that is conducive to human health. And then in order to give that right a bit of teeth and make it effective, South Africa enacted the National Environmental Management Air Quality Act, which essentially has as one of its objectives to protect and enhance the quality of air by securing an environment that is healthy for humans. So essentially we have this constitutional right, which, as most constitutions are, frames this overall legal framework, and the act is meant to give that right teeth and to, on the ground, make a difference to people's lives. In fact, one of the objectives of the act is as well to ensure that some of the poorest, like Amos and Catherine, are protected in their air quality and can live normal human lives. Now, one of the primary mechanisms by which the act does its job is something called minimum emission standards. And what that is that the Department for Environmental Affairs comes up with a number and they say, okay, activities that fall within a certain defined category, like generating power from Eskom, must stick to or must put in interventions in order to limit their emissions of, let's say, sulfur dioxide to a certain number of particles per million. And that was hailed as a great thing, and that should be fantastic. But in April 2020, the department came out and they released a statement to say that the minister has decided that these postponements, well, that there will be postponements to requiring companies, particularly like Eskom and Sasol, the biggest polluters in South Africa, allowing them to not have to undergo this very costly process of modifying their plants and reducing their emissions. And in this statement, which was rather striking to me, we see that the department, and I'm going to paraphrase here, quoted the Constitution saying that everybody has the right to clean air, but this right is qualified in the Constitution by the phrase progressive realization. And what that essentially means is that the department has taken this potentially very groundwork piece of legislation to try and lower the particles and noxious chemicals in the air, and they basically gutted it, saying that, well, it's based on this right to a healthy environment, but progressive realization means that Eskom at the current point in time cannot afford to install measures to, for example, reduce the sulfuric dioxide emissions at the moment. And so they have said that any plant built before 2010, which is basically all of them barring Medupi and Gazuli, is now not going to be subject to these standards, and this has been updated to 2025, meaning that until 2025, nothing is going to happen. And then I read a Greenpeace report that was critical of this decision, and it essentially said that because of the delay in implementation, there are expected to be 16,000 premature deaths directly linked to Eskom and Sasol not having to install these preventative measures. So I didn't want to depress everybody, so I came up with a heading called Hope in the Smog. And this is really where my dissertation lies, is that I take a very in-depth look at South Africa's renewable energy program, and I try and work out, okay, well, what is going to be the impact of this renewable energy program? And essentially, if you look at South Africa's Paris Agreement and our nationally determined contributions, as well as a white paper released by Cabinet, the government recognizes that South Africa's electrical generation system, particularly coal, is the biggest single contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. And so what they've done is they've gone on this aggressive program to try and beef up through private investment, unlike Eskom, try and beef up our renewable energy generation mix to try and increase the proportion of clean energy in the overall energy mix, reducing our reliance on coal. We are still going to have a problem with baseload power, but that's a discussion for another day. And just to be current, 2 weeks ago, the Minister of Energy announced that private companies can now do up to 100 megawatts of their own power. It's not clear yet whether that's going to be only renewables, but I think given just 100 megawatts and the speed at which you can set up renewable energy, I think it's probably companies will economically favor renewable energy sources. And now to conclude, I wanted to sum up to say that, you know, the people that live near these power stations, like the Mklangu family, they live there for the mining, for the coal jobs. They live there because mines are often, as was the case in their example, mines give a proportion of their coal to the poorest communities as a donation, and they are able to take the donation and warm themselves. we can see that despite the constitutional right, despite the Air Quality Act, the people that are most affected are the poor, which is completely contrast to what the idea of electrical generation and access to energy is supposed to be, which is this massive drive since 1994 for socioeconomic development and to try and connect electricity to as many people as possible, but people are still dying. Catherine, for example, says that it's the dust in the air that's making her so sick. And so despite the Constitution and this act, there's just not enough being done on the ground, particularly with the lack of political will, as we were discussing earlier in Dalit's presentation, that there's no political will to take the Constitution and the legislation with teeth and put it on the ground to change lives. But as I said, there is a push with renewable energy, particularly South Africa's in the 5th round of its renewable energy bid. And also, hopefully within the next 60 days, government will gazette that allowance of 100 megawatts, allowing some of the major Eskom users, such as aluminum smelters, heavy industry, to try and switch from Eskom to more renewable sources of energy. And yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rory. Very, very thought-provoking presentation about the situation in South Africa, and I really appreciate that you put a human face on it right from the start. I think that's terrifically important. I'm actually involved in a lawsuit in South Africa, which is kind of just, I guess, coincidentally based in the Mpumalanga region, where there is horrific air pollution from coal mining and from the Sasol plant. And it's a case brought by 2 environmental justice organizations, and I think they were quite surprised when the government's defense in that case was basically, look, yes, these people have a right to a healthy environment, but it's subject to this concept of progressive realization. And I guess my question is, about your understanding of progressive realization, because this area, the Highveld priority area, was designated in 2007 or 2008 as a priority area under the National Environmental Management Act, as you mentioned, for air quality. And yet it appears to me, based on all of the evidence, that nothing's been done to actually improve air quality in the intervening 14 years. So can you address that question of, does progressive realization mean that a government can just throw up its hands and say, well, we'll do something later? Or does it actually come with some level of obligations to take action towards the ultimate goal of fulfilling the right?
So I think that progressive realization is a term that's unfortunately in this example repeatedly used throughout our Constitution. There's progressive realization in health. There's progressive realization in the right to water. And it's had a long journey of jurisprudence and precedence. And unfortunately, in my legal opinion, I think that the argument that it's progressive realization will be able to hold in that, these companies have to be able to do it at a scale that they can afford. However, if I might add something, I'm sure you're aware of the Thabametsi case with South Africa. And one of the ways, thankfully, that a lot of environmental groups have gotten around the establishment of new coal power stations is that instead, and this is rather sad, but instead of challenging these in courts on an environmental perspective, so saying, okay, well, if you establish another coal power fire station, you're going to significantly put the people in the area at risk. What they're doing instead is they're often challenging it on procedural grounds. So, for example, in this specific case, they were able to go to the court and they were able to use a procedural administrative piece of legislation that we have here in South Africa to basically say that the authorization to build the coal power station is fundamentally flawed because you haven't considered the environmental impact report, which was never submitted to the decision maker. And so to answer your question, do I think that progressive realization is going to be a tangible mechanism to try and get environmental rights into the fray? I don't think so. But I think that there is a gradual movement towards the courts specifically recognizing that an environmental impact report and the impact on the environment as a whole should play a much more significant part in any authorization. And so I suppose in a way, progressive realization can be worked into that. But the main thing is going to be procedural and really looking at what is the impact on the environment. Has this been considered to its greatest extent required by our various acts like NEMA, the air quality, and PAJA administrative.
And my other question for you, Rory, is just one out of curiosity, which is, it seems like, it's been over 25 years since this right to a healthy environment was in the South African Constitution, but it seems like there haven't been very many cases that are directly attempting to enforce that right, despite a wide range of quite pressing environmental problems in South Africa. I'm just curious as to, and Dalit, you can weigh in on this as well if you like, but I'm curious as to why you think that's the case. I'm sure Dina has some thoughts as well.
I think that, so I think it's just, given the procedural failures in South Africa, it's going to be easier legally to attack a procedural structural element of a decision to establish a coal-fired power station, as opposed to a constitutional argument where you would inevitably have to bring in human dignity as a right, and also link that to the right to air quality and clean air, because it's framed in the Air Quality Act as a minimum emission. It's not framed as a constitutional right, which is so difficult, because you're taking an academic concept of justice and trying to apply it to a metric, which it doesn't work. And it's easier, in my opinion, to go with a administrative procedural challenge.
I'm going to stop us there. Dalit's done something very clever. She's added a comment in the chat. That's a super use of our time. I'd encourage everyone else to do that as well if you have some more thoughts you'd like to share. And we're going to go straight over to Celeste. Celeste, the time starts now. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rory.
Okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity. I have lost my, okay, sorry. Well, my name is Celeste, and I'll be sharing some aspect of the research that I'm developing through these years. Yeah, I think you can see it, right? Okay. Well, my work, I'm from Bolivia, and I'm working on a research that is based on the study of social legal practice around the enforceability of women's rights in peasant and indigenous contexts concerning their access to land. And well, as we all know, the reality in this complex work is demanding an effective change. Continuously, it's mobilizing group of people who are looking for answers to dignified lives in different parts of the world. And I think this is great because this is moving forward to an integrated understanding of human rights. So in considering the third generation of rights, we are talking about solidarity rights and collective rights. But solidarity for whom and what does represent collective voices? At the beginning of my research, I had to deal with questions like if the collective interest is representing women, and answer why is this important, why this question is important. So in order to answer those questions, it has been important to notice how power relationships have affected the recognition of women's rights. And if we look backward, it's been inevitable to see and put in value how women have been fighting for a collective interest and in the name of their own gender, and especially for future generation of women, but also how their claims and interests and priorities go second in the agenda. Most of the time, if we see, they have a collective interest, but at the end, is determined by male values and male priorities. So this could be seen in the use of language in some of the milestone documents in international law of human rights, and how our words are missing, and how is a controversial use of some words. The same pattern we can see in the claims that are all the time on hold in at the international level and in the same term in the Bolivian legal system. And also, well, in a third way to see it, the special protection for vulnerable groups through the application of non-discrimination principle has been trying to deal in equal situation, and this could be the case of the Joint Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment in 2017. And I put this as an example, but we have another examples that we all know in bonding documents. But I use this example because the same year, the World Economic Forum has said that it will take at least 217 years until women have equal pay and representation in the workplace. So I think we can agree that the answer of inequality in the world is not being that effective as we wish until now, and the future is not too much different. So of course there's a lot of reasons for this, but one of those could be that we are trying to adapt a law that at the beginning didn't recognize this group of people and others like right holders in a full way, with considering their interests, values, or other characteristics. This could be seen in the law making process. And as we know, the justice is represented by a female body, but the lawmaking process has different kind of priorities. For example, using characteristics like universality, objectivity, and generality, this represent the rational part of the law. And in a world that is organized in a binary way, the opposite would be the emotional side that is linked with the female view. And the thing is that actually this is not even true. The law objectivity actually is the male subjectivity, and we have a lot of scholars that are been working on that idea and supporting this thesis. But for me, it's been important to give attention to these values because it helps to understand how social and political priorities are developed. For one hand, for example, with the strategies on how women look for the enforceability of the rights, and for the other, to analyze assumptions and priorities related to the development model. For example, the assumption on a patriarchal model is that nature is a resource. So a clean river is unproductive because it doesn't represent an economic income in a big scale for the state and other companies, not for the families, not for the values, local values interest. My fieldwork is based on a participation action research in an area in Cochabamba. It's in the middle of Bolivia, in Carcaje. And I've been working on a capacity building process with agroecological producers associated to a national network of economic peasant organization. And in order to carry on an open dialogue, I have been implementing tools from the theater of the oppressed and strategies from social cartography. And actually this painting represents one of the pictures that I took in one of the activities where we were discussing the meaning of land in their lives. And it could be seen clearly how land means economic autonomy, community, access to political, economic, and social organizations. It means family and means dignified work. And at the beginning, I mentioned this complexity of the word. And actually, Bolivia is an example of complexity. And since 2009, we have a constitution that recognizes different kinds of groups. You can see it in the green column. We can speak about a group with the special protection, groups that have different kind of dynamic and actions through social movements, and also recognize collective rights for some groups. So I'm not trying to label and organize the identity that is plural, but just in an effort to understand. I've been working with this group of women that are leaders, are peasant, are indigenous in the area of Carcaje, in the upper valley of Cochabamba, and they can be related with the Quechua nation, it could be considered part of the peasant communities with territorial grassroots organization. It could be considered as an intermediate community. So the theory of the intersectionality has helped me to understand the complexity around the plural identities, and as the concept of indigenous native peasant without a comma is impossible to separate. So we could see that these are a plural and integrated identity. We can see characteristics that intersect them and reveal system of oppression because of the gender, ethnicity, impoverishment, but also opportunities to collective action through social and political organization. So the natural strategy is integration, is community, and it's family. They could be part of, at the same time, of different kind of organizations and different kind of strategy from the community to remain strong and defend the land they are working on. So the yellow part, it's referring my work in this area, Carcaje, and right now I'm starting a third step in my fieldwork that is specifically in indigenous autonomy, Racaipampa. It's in Cochabamba also, and it's like well, in this I'm trying to just as an example to reveal common scenarios from the testimony of women where both are talking about the daily basic interests of a dignified life for their families. So we have examples in Bolivia also where a group of women are defending lands and territory from a extractivist model, but they are defending the system of their lives that comes with that land. So there is the profound meaning of that goes beyond of an ownership of the land. And this is not new.
Sentence, Celeste.
Yeah, okay. This is not new because we have the Chipko movement as an example of this connection. And just to finish sharing thoughts, I think that Speak for Singularity, Dignity and Emotion in Particular Places has a profound purpose such as subsistence and sustainability because it has values from the locals. So collective rights has to give attention to the women in a specific way because their values, priorities can give a better understanding of how collective rights can be seen from a female perspective that intersect women in general. I'm finished. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Celeste. Thank you for your provocative and really thoughtful presentation. I think it's extremely interesting, and I'm curious about the idea of collective rights is a challenging one for human rights scholarship generally. And how are collective rights recognized in the Bolivian Constitution or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are. And there have a lot of contradiction inside because we have the recognition, the self-governance right for populations that are recognized by the state as a native, indigenous, peasant community. So they can be exercise that right. But there are a lot of contradictions because for one hand, the state recognized their existing previous to the colony, but they ask for a proof that they were previous, their existing was previous the colony. And in the practice, the state gives a certificate that says, okay, you have a community that is ancestral, so you can be allowed to have this right. And the practice, that is a little funny, but the most worrying thing is that in the practice, the state is trying to submit the municipal autonomy to this indigenous autonomy, and it has different kind of natures, and this is getting it's becoming a problem because at the beginning this was an expectation from people, indigenous populations, but in the practice it's getting confused and they are they're being limited in their opportunity to defend their territories because in the practice it's not a fulfilled right that is recognized. It's just a little bit.
Right. Yeah, we have that same problem in Canada where indigenous nations are being confused with municipal governments, and it's not, they're not really the same thing at all. I'm curious as to what impact the UN declarations have had in Bolivia, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. Are those useful documents for the people that you're working with?
No, well, for the people who are in this path to enforceability of their rights, the most important instrument is our constitution. And this is now, well, right now, the moment who they are trying to reconnect with that speech at the beginning was that the constitution recognized this collective right for these nations, and they are trying to remind to the government or the state in general that their right is being recognized constitutionally. And it doesn't matter if the law are asking for a specific certificate or specific procedures, because the constitution goes first. So right now it's more important that than the documents. But a good thing is that Bolivia has recognized through a law, a national law, the Declaration of Indigenous Populations. So in our territory, it's a law. It's not just a declaration. It has an important impact in terms of law and enforceability of rights. No?
Right. But of course, in Bolivia, you have the same problem that Juan was speaking of earlier, and that Hector and Juliana were speaking of. Like, how do you reconcile these collective rights of these indigenous peasant communities, and particularly women, with the extractivist model that continues to predominate in Latin America?
I'm gonna stop you. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Oh,
that's one to put in your pocket and think about. We've got one more presentation. We're going to have to squeeze it in, and that's Digno.
Thank you very much. Now you can see my presentation, no? I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you very much for this great opportunity. My name is Digno Montalban. I am an Ecuadorian PhD researcher, and it's a great honor for me to be part of this working program seminar. In this talk, I will briefly present some results of my PhD research. My research focuses on the InterAmerican Court of Human Rights and its jurisprudence regarding environmental issues. I would like to share some reflections about several innovative legal decisions that, until my knowledge, is the first time that an international human rights court incorporates an ecocentric view of human rights in its legal reasoning. Drawing on this experience, I will present several conclusions about not only the possibility, but moreover, the urgent need of making explicit the influence of the ecocentrism within the current debates of human rights. The Inter-American Court is one of the 3 regional courts for the protection of human rights. At international level, over the years, this court has been praised for its groundbreaking rulings on many human rights issues, such as the right to truth and the indigenous people's rights. In this line, since 2001, it has developed an important case law on the relationship between human rights and the environment. This jurisprudence has been based so far on the instrumental anthropocentric protection. Under this approach, preserving the environment is important just because it's relevant for the guarantee of human rights. However, the court is showing important signs that it's moving beyond this dominant human rights position. In November 2017, the court issued the advisory opinion number OC 2317, which develops the emerging right to a healthy environment as an autonomous right, which, although not explicitly explained by the court in these terms, appears to be inspired by an ecocentric view. In the words of the court, this right seeks to protect nature and the environment not only because of the connection with living organisms which with the planet is shared, also worthy of protection themselves. This new right, as stated by the court itself, protects the components of the environment, such as forests, rivers, seas, and others, has legal interests in themselves, even in the absence of certainty or evidence of risk to individual persons. More than 2 years later, in its most recent judgment on the matter, the case of indigenous communities members of the La Cajonera Association versus Argentina of February 2020, the court declares for the first time in a contentious case, the violation of the right to a healthy environment has an autonomous right, reiterating that this right seeks to protect nature, not only for its utility or effects with respect to human beings, but it's important for the other living organisms with whom the planet is shared. These two jurisprudential developments seem to indicate that the interest in the preservation of nature no longer focuses exclusively on the human being. The centric view of the human-nature relationship within the Inter-American human rights system, which has been incorporated into the legal discourses, leads to the idea of the rights of nature. As a result, from my point of view, two forms of environmental protection are currently coexisting within the Inter-American human rights system: the dominant anthropocentric protection and an emerging ecocentric protection based on the rights of nature. But while the ecocentric protection offers important advantages for the protection of non-human subjects, such as rivers, at the same time, it provokes many questions, like, does it make any sense to speak of a more than human approach to human rights? And if so, why to implement this ecocentric approach? My analysis showed that explicit incorporation of this ecocentric approach to international human rights law is not only relevant, but also necessary for two reasons. One is strategic and other substantive. Firstly, the separate legal frameworks of the rights of nature and the rights of human beings tend in practice to overlap and dispute each other's spaces. Taking this into account, the new approach of the Inter-American Court, in my opinion, allows a more fruitful dialogue and a more holistic view of the legal challenges at stake. Second, it is true that the traditional foundation of human rights is liberal and anthropocentric. However, this has not been, nor need to be always the case. New social demands has been pushing to debate other possible foundations for human rights, in some cases incorporating correction to the liberal model, and in others going beyond it entirely. I consider that the ecocentrism has part of these social demands that are redefining the concept of the human. Under ecocentrism, nature has a dialectical vision. It has active and passive role in the relationship with human beings. Its approach is teleological, focusing on the life cycles of the nature and advocating for an ecological justice that take into account that the biogeochemical and physical processes that create the conditions that enable life on the earth and in which the humans are integrated. The right of nature do not forget that the ecological dynamics also involve relationship of competition and predation in which the human is included. Then the concentric human being does not cease to be anthropocentric. That would be impossible. Inevitably, we think and see as human, even when we categorize or defend nature. Thus, when we speak of an ecocentric human being, what we propose is to build a new understanding of the human that overcome the vision of an independent, rational subject, different to nature, in order to build a new categorization of the human that responds to the interrelationship and cooperation with the natural world that allow us to define ourselves. Under this new foundation, the human is not only anthropocentric. This has been established by the Supreme Court of Colombia. It's also built from the respect for the part of oneself that is composed by the nature. These characteristics make to ecocentrism, in my opinion, the only coherent approach for a possible incorporation of nature as a subject of right in the discourse of human rights, because first, does not dispute the existence of anthropocentric interests. Indeed, it incorporates them as part of the relationship that occurs in the natural world. And second, the tension between the human beings and the rest of nature is part of its essence. In resume, thinking nature beyond the human, but with the human, is a true emancipative potential of the rights of nature, and what makes it the best ally for the human rights. However, taking rights beyond the limits proposed by the original philosophical background generates tensions that, if are not made explicit, can threaten, for example, collective rights that are already thought to be conquered for indigenous peoples. To make this point, I will briefly analyze two of the most recent rulings about indigenous peoples, the case Kalina Olokono versus Suriname of 2015 and the case Lacajonat versus Argentina of 2020. In the Suriname case was demanded, among others, the establishment and continuity of two natural parks located in the part of the Kalina Olokono ancestral territory. These reserves intend to protect sea turtle nesting sites, while the Kalina Olokono people has a traditional practice, the collection of sea turtle eggs. The fact in this case drives to the dispute between the discourse of the environment preservation and the right of these tribal people. as a result of this confrontation, the court, for the first time in its jurisprudence, just declared the violation of the right to participate in the decision-making about the administration of the natural parks, but the control and therefore the ownership of these lands remain with the state. During 18 years, the court considered that land and territory in terms of judicial protection were an inseparable whole. However, in its most recent ruling about indigenous peoples, the La Cajonat Association versus Argentina, this line of legal reasoning seems to change. In this case, the court separates the right to land, which is declared to be related to the right to property, from the right to territory, which is linked to the economic, social, and cultural and environmental rights. In my view, this explicit division creates a structure whereby it's no longer indispensable to interconnect these two rights. At the same time, this ruling has internationally been recognized as a landmark case because it's the first time that the court recognized the violation of the before mentioned right to a healthy environment has an autonomous right. In my point of view, the idea of the nature has a new subject of protection together with the division of the land and territory rights may provide additional arguments in favor of natural parks located in indigenous territories. Based on this brief analysis of these important cases of the InterAmerican Court, I'm ending my talk with two recommendations. First, it is urgent to recognize the emerging ecocentric human rights, because otherwise we will not be giving an account of the real interests at stake, diminishing the debate and with it the argumentative quality expected for the resolution of issues of this complexity. A second, it is essential that legal scholars across the continents start to discuss and theorizing about the tension between the dominant anthropocentric foundation and the emerging ecocentric turn in human rights. This can open a path to develop adequate new legal tools for the environmental crisis that we are facing. I'm really looking forward to hear your comments. I'm happy to contribute in this important international dialogue. Thank you very much.
Right on time.
Perfect. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Very, very fascinating topic. Obviously one near and dear to my heart. I've written a book that's just been published in Spanish now called Los Derechos de la Naturaleza. And so I find myself nodding along in agreement with much of what you've said. I think one of the challenges is that, you know, you framed this in the context of the Latin American legal system, where we have these powerful precedents, both at the national level in countries like Colombia and at the regional level from, you know, the advisory opinion and also the La Cajonat case. But, you know, you contrast that with the European Court of Human Rights, which has explicitly said there is no right to nature protection in the European Convention. And I wonder how you think you can bridge that gap between the Latin American regional system and the European regional human rights system.
I think that the most clear explanation for me is the legal mobilization. I mean, in the case of Latin America, the particularities of the Latin American movement, ecological movement that has been an ally of the indigenous peoples' demands, I mean, has created a new understanding of the rights on the law that is representing in the Ecuadorian constitution, the Bolivian constitution, also the Colombian constitution and the rulings of the Colombian Constitutional Court that are like giving new understanding of the law, a new understanding of the law. And I think that the clear explanation is that the different circumstances that live both continents and the different demandings that the civil society expects from the courts, so creates different understandings about what is the meaning of the law, and in this case of the rights. No, I think that is the most clear example. In the case of Latin America, it's on the Inter-American system, it's really interesting to see how the first organization of the Inter-American system chart proposed as part of the goal of the American countries, the fostering of the mining on the 40s. This was part of the objective of the Inter-American system at the very first moment. And this has developed to the idea of rights of nature. So, and it's the same text, and it hasn't changed.
Right.
So, and this only can be explained because of I think, the social mobilization, and because of what is called like the legal mobilization, no, from the society.
Yeah, no, that's a very exciting and dynamic aspect of Latin America for sure. I mean, in my role as special rapporteur, I've filed a number of amicus briefs in other jurisdictions trying to cross-pollinate those legal ideas that are coming from the Inter-American Court into other systems. Haven't seen the uptake, but there's still a number of decisions pending. So I think it's terrific work that you're doing, Digno, and thank you for that.
Thank you very much for your comment.
Thank you, everyone. I think a special thanks to David for his comments on all these papers, but also to our presenters. Those were 6 compelling and fascinating papers, and I'm really glad that you all came and did this. David, I know, has to go. Thank you again for your time and for your comments and for just kind of generating such fascinating conversations, a whole series of them in such a short amount of time. But if anyone wants to stay here, I'll keep this space open, and you're very welcome to stay and chat to each other a little bit.
I do. Thank you very much, Dina. I just want to say before I go that those were really terrific papers, and it's inspiring for someone like me to see that there's so much intellectual energy and passion and that degree of eloquence and deep thinking that's behind all of your work. So thank you for that, and I look forward to intersecting paths with you again in the future.